Introductions. For our first panelist tonight, we have Eileen Quigley, the Executive Director for the Clean Energy Transition Institute. Director Quigley, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and how your work relates to clean cars?
Sure. My name is Eileen Quigley, and I'm the Executive Director of the Clean Energy Transition Institute. In terms of how my work relates to clean cars, or in general, the Institute is a nonprofit organization that works on helping the Northwest figure out how to accelerate deep decarbonization. And so an enormously important part of our work is electrification broadly, and certainly electrification of the transportation sector. We work in all sectors of the economy, but as it relates to clean cars, I'd say that our modeling shows that we really should be at about 100% electric vehicle sales by 2035 at the latest for passenger vehicles, and really about 100% electric vehicle stock by 2050. So clean cars is really important to deep decarbonization.
Great, thank you, Director Quigley. Our next panelist is Jun Liu, a chemical engineering and materials science professor at Utub, who is the Washington Research Foundation Chair in Clean Energy. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work and how it relates to clean cars?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. This is a very important, very timely topic. I'm very happy to participate. In addition to what I mentioned, that I serve as a faculty in the university, I'm also joint scientist with Pacific Northwest National Lab, where I work for a long time. I serve as a highest ranked scientist over there for many years. And right now, I am one of the very few faculty with actually 50% University of Washington appointment and 50% appointment with Pacific Northwest National Lab. In addition to that, I serve as the director of the Innovation Center for Battery 500 Consortium, which is the largest program in the US to support the development of next generation batteries for electric car application. So I'm very happy to participate in this discussion.
Thanks, Professor Liu. Our next panelist is Professor Mark Hallenbeck, who is the director of the Washington State Transportation Center at UW. Professor, please introduce yourself.
I'm not an EV expert. I'm a transportation guy, so I do transportation planning. I do transit versus cars, how that affects urban development, how that affects equity in the region, and what that means for everything in terms of how you get around in the world. So I'll be your transportation generalist for the day, I think.
Thank you, Professor Hallenbeck. Our last panelist tonight is Clark Gilman, a city council member for Olympia, who is also on the Intercity Transit Authority Board. Councilman Gilman, please tell us a little bit about yourself and how your work relates to clean cars.
Absolutely. I think that the reason I was asked on this panel is to show you that you can be old and still be hopeful and dreaming about a new future with clean energy. Right?
You have competition with that. There's competition on this panel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lots of competition.
Very good. So I serve as mayor pro tem on the city council, but I've in some of my preparation to get to this place where I'm at, I worked alongside Eileen Quigley for a few years as a community organizer working on clean energy campaigns, and as somebody who was trying to make it to a lot of city meetings only using bicycle and bus, I've got a little electric Fiat now that I can also talk to you about using an electric car, not as instead of an SUV for long commutes, but instead of a bicycle for rainy nights to get to nighttime meetings. And it's the perfect match for running around in town. So as I was introduced, I'm also on the board of Intercity Transit, where we're thinking a lot both about trying to get more people to ride mass transit and about the future of transit and most likely electrification. So, looking forward to the panel.
Great, thank you. We also have two special guests joining us. Our first guest is Huynh, an Olympia City Council member as well. So would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. My name is Quinn. I go by Yen as well. I serve alongside Clark on the Olympia City Council. I am pretty new to climate justice, environmental conversations. Just the last couple of years, I had the opportunity to meet just last week with WashPirg students, and I learned a whole wealth of information. I am most concerned with equity when it comes to climate justice and to really achieve justice. And I don't believe that can be done without equity. And I think folks may agree with me here on the panel. So I would say I'm an expert in not traditionally, being included in these conversations, not growing up with that cultural lexicon of even talking about environmental justice, right? Or just environmental impacts overall. Not to say that that me or my family and loved ones don't care about the environment. It's just about that hierarchy of needs, right? So I was, so pleased to be newly appointed to the City Council, and certainly cannot take credit for, but can say that I gleefully voted to help pass the climate emergency resolution, the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, as well as the interlocal agreement to implement the said Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. So just so happy to be here with everyone, and ears are open, and let's bring everyone with us into this conversation.
Great, thank you, Council Member. And if you have anything to add during our panel, feel free to do so. And finally, introducing our last special guest is Tara Zolfaghari, who is a high school climate activist. So why don't you go ahead and take a few minutes to introduce yourself and talk to us about your message.
Yeah, hi. My name is Tara Zolfaghari. I'm currently an intern at Fairville, Washington. We're the group advocating for ranked choice voting. I'm also vice chair of the Justice and Safety Committee in the Mayor's Youth Commission of Tacoma. And recently I joined the Sunrise Movement in my local hub, Sunrise Tacoma. And so I've been getting more involved with the climate crisis because it's so important to me, because I'm 15 years old. I'm a sophomore at Silicon High School, and that means my generation will be directly impacted by this climate crisis's damage. And that's really scary because it's hard to, think about my future when I'm not really sure. I know the intensity of the situation, and it's hard to think about in 10 years, what is my life going to be like? It's hard to think about my future career, my family, my school, and just, will I have a planet to live on? And it's easy to feel hopeless for me, but instead I try to aim to see actions being taken and legislation passed that will provide a better future for me and my generation. And that's why I think transitioning to clean cars by 2030 is so important, because transportation is the #1 cause of fossil fuel emissions in Washington state. And the current transportation system is just unsafe and creates a dirty and unhealthy environment. And I know personally, I'm a runner. And so in the grand scheme of things, this is so small, but every time I run, like cars just pass me and I get gusts of like dirty air and gas in my face. And I'm like, well, this is such a small thing, but imagine if that just keeps piling and around the world, and that like it obviously gets worse and worse. And so that's why it's so important to transition to clean cars, because it'll disincentivize companies to make fuel cars and instead provide affordable transportation that won't harm our environment and help prevent and mend the damages that we've been facing for so many years for a better future for me and my peers. And I just really hope I can see action being taken, and I really want to push my legislators to make change, and that's why I'm fighting for preventing the climate crisis. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. Now that everyone has been introduced, we can get into the questions and discussion portion. So just a brief reminder before we do that, we do have a short amount of time, so please try to be mindful about how long your responses are. And with that being said, our first question is for everyone on the panel. How do you think implementing clean cars will affect your field of work?
Okay, I'll start. I'm the transportation guy. From a general transportation perspective, they will have zero impact on the performance of the transportation system. That is, the performance of the transportation system is in large part driven by the shape of our land use, where people live, how that is connected, and what your options are. If you live in downtown Seattle, you have lots of options. If you live in downtown Olympia, you have a few options. If you live in the rural portions of Thurston County, you drive. That's driven, but that's given by how we built our communities. In terms of once you own a car, whether it's gas or electric, it's almost irrelevant to the decision-making process. So from a congestion utilization standpoint, it has no impact. The biggest concern I have, and I haven't seen addressed in the bill, is money. And it's not money for the people who are buying and using the vehicles. It's that the transportation network, primarily the road system, in this state is paid for almost entirely with a gas tax. And while that is declining as gasoline usage per mile goes down, as we have more and more efficient cars, if you swap out all of those gas cars for electric vehicles, if you don't change how we pay for the road system, then you have zero money. And it's not quite zero because you're allowing older cars to exist, but that is a huge, to do the electric car shift without a payment shift on how you're going to pay for miles driven, that is an utter disaster. So that's a key thing I don't see in here. Doesn't mean you can't solve it, but it is hand in hand with trying to come up with a new clean way to drive, to use your vehicles. You actually have to change the taxation system in order to generate the money necessary to do all of the things that support where roads are, what other vehicles are used, how you make things safe for biking and walking. So don't forget the money side of it as you pursue going to electrification. So that's the transportation planners, traffic engineers side of the world.
I think I would pick up on the money part there and also talk about the equity implications. And I think that we do need to transition as quickly as we possibly can to clean electricity and using as much of it as possible for all end uses, not just transportation. That's really a key tenet of deep decarbonization. But where I spend time picking up on Professor Hallenbeck is the question of money for ensuring that those who have been most marginalized throughout the history of this nation are not left behind yet again. And there are enormous issues around health benefits and access to jobs in the same way that you were talking about the rural communities that are dependent upon cars. So many lower income folks are also pushed out of the big cities because they're so expensive to live in and therefore are driving cars that are both emission spewing, but also very expensive. And the air quality where most of those folks live is also impacted. And there's just so many issues around equity that I think we need to be addressing at the exact same time that we're addressing this climate crisis. And I consider that to be an opportunity. And I think that because this transformation is so huge that we have to make and so disruptive, we should spend as much energy talking about the technology and the economics of the solutions as we do talking about how to address systemic racism and deep income inequality in this nation and in our region.
I have a tendency to talk way too much, so I will happily, I agree with many things you said and I can bring up points, but I'm going to be quiet for the time being so other people can talk for a second. But when you're ready for me to weigh in again, I'll happily chat, but other people should have a chance.
So I just want to follow up on what's going to happen in the future. I think Eileen really is talking about this urgent trend that's going to happen. What we are going to see is that from 2030 to 2050, somewhere in between, not only we are going to have the electrification of the transportation sector, but we also want to replace the existing fossil energy-based infrastructure with more than 70% renewable energy and zero carbon by 2050. That's a very tall order. It's very difficult to achieve, but I think there's really good consensus among the government and industrial organizations all over the world to do that. In order for us to do that, I noticed some of the questions you have been written down, right? Do we have the right infrastructure to do it? The answer absolutely is no. So the existing energy infrastructure, including transportation, is based on centralized fossil energy. Essentially everything like a kind of based by utility, you get utility bill, those kind of things. A group of us from many places, national lab and universities, were looking very closely. I'm pretty sure Mark would have a lot of comment on it. We're looking very closely. If we really want to make that happen, what's that energy network, the infrastructure, what's going to look like? It's not going to be the same as today. We need not only have new regulations, we need to have new policy, new technology, new distribution system, new transportation system, essentially a new way of life to accommodate that. And you would have to really use some good imagination to see how that's going to happen. And we hope that's going to happen that will benefit all the population. Like, for example, we talk about transportation, we're mostly talking about the outer metropolitan area. But we have to think about the rural area. I have seen like in places in China, in other countries, they have been developing different kind of transportation mode for between villages, for farms, those kind of things. Short distance, very, very low cost EVs. And I don't see that happening in the US yet, but I think it's something we really need to pay attention to, that will really improve the quality of life of people in rural areas, and at the same time, improve our environment. I also want to add, that's probably slightly different from Mark's opinion, that electrification is not just going from gas to electricity to solar. Actually, your lifestyle, if you have an electric car, your lifestyle actually changed quite a bit. I have a hybrid vehicle. I drive between Tri-Cities here like very often. My friend just bought a Tesla. He drives quite a bit long distance. He kept on telling me how that has changed his life. That's something I think if we do it carefully, it can really benefit. It's not just energy, it's really thinking about benefiting what we do every day, think about benefiting also different populations, different regions.
No, as a policymaker, when we come down to making the local decisions, a lot of what Mark started us out about, that it's just the decisions we've been making are about encouraging denser settlement in town and less suburban sprawl. And that's to change the pattern of how far people have to drive. Because whether it's an electric car, some goofy hydrogen technology, it's internal combustion, whatever it is, the cleanest unit of energy is the one you don't consume. It's the one you don't use, right? I always think back to something I was told a long time ago, that can you imagine getting into a 2-ton vehicle to try to go 60 miles an hour to pick up a pint of ice cream and bring it back home, right? You know, you think of the amount of calories that you spent to get that ice cream. It's an incredible energy subsidy on our life. And So walkable neighborhoods are a priority for the city. Having services within, within a half a mile walk of where you live is really our first line of what we're trying to impact. And then the electric vehicles to replace trips that people need to make, I think is really important. And that transition to clean energy. But I just want to emphasize that transportation planning and land use planning is a super important element of getting to a clean energy economy, or that deep decarbonization in time, right? And I just want to.
I don't know. It was only that one.
And then I just want to very briefly comment on the new funding mechanisms. I serve on the Regional Planning Council, thinking about the future of planning and roads. And the State Department of Transportation has been running a trial. Probably many of you have a good to go transponder on your car. And they've been doing a pay as you drive, charge you for the miles you drive as a pilot project to imagine what they're going to do to collect the same amount of revenue as the gas tax. And then the last couple of legislatures have added a hefty registration fee onto my little car. So they're collecting a few $100s more on electric cars each year for tabs right now.
Thank you. Our next question is going to be.
Okay, go ahead. Go for your next.
What was that?
I was going to say, go to your next question. I was going to jump back to the environmental justice edition. If I can do that, or go to your next question. It's your panel. I'm just here to be the obnoxious transportation guy.
No, you're fine. You can go right ahead.
So sticking with my economic thing, and yes, what the Transportation Commission is doing is very interesting, and there's lots of detail to there. It's way beyond what you can do tonight, but that's something well worth paying attention to. One of the real issues when going to modern EV and saying you're going to have to buy an EV right now, EV vehicles, this is right now. Don't ask me what they will be in 2030 or 2035, but right now, EV vehicles are expensive up front and cheaper to maintain and operate over time. The problem is if you are poor, you don't have the money up front in order to make it up later. So the poor tend to buy old vehicles, which are the most polluting and the most difficult to maintain and the least reliable. So on the environmental justice side, the richer parts of the world, of the community, will get the primary benefits of the carbon monoxide reductions. Everybody will gain some from the overall reductions in pollutants, but the localized pollutants will actually end up being improved the most in rich areas, and they will remain the worst in the poor areas unless, again, economically you change and provide incentives and provide particular tax breaks in order to allow people who don't have the resources to buy these more expensive vehicles up front. So be aware that there are other financial impacts there. And then just because I love finances, when you talk to the power people, and I am not a power expert, but I was talking transportation at a big power conference up at the University of Victoria. And one of the power people said, if you look at how we pay for long distance transmission of power, it is totally wrong the way we incentivize how we shift power from one part of the country to the other. We don't have an economic mechanism to capture our new renewables. Southern California actually generates too much power during the bright sunny days, and there's no economic incentive to ship that elsewhere where it can be used. Similarly with Wyoming and wind. So we actually have to change the financial system to encourage people to make money in the transmission of electricity, to ship it from where we are generating it to where we need it in a new way. Because as Professor Liu said, the system we've built works for fossil fuel. It doesn't work for where we're going to be generating and how we're going to be using electric transmission, electric energy as well. So that too is something you need to actually resolve in order to efficiently use the electricity that you need to generate and actually use. All good things, they're just multiple layers to this very complex problem.
I would just add that it's not just the economics or the way that the power that the utilities are reimbursed. We have a transmission challenge all across the nation, but definitely here. Something my institute spends a lot of time thinking about, because the amount of electricity that we're going to need to, the load that we're going to have to serve. Our modeling shows that we're going to have a 97% growth in electricity over end use demand from 2020 to 2050, as Professor Liu was talking about. This is not just cars, it's across the board. And we have an enormous challenge with getting the inland wind from Wyoming and Montana, which is where it will be cheapest and strongest, and all of the southern solar that you were mentioning, Mark. It's not just California, it's also Arizona and New Mexico and the whole western grid, and all the offshore wind that's going to be built off of Oregon and California. So we have a massive infrastructure, fascinating and important and potentially very serious job creator, but it's a complicated issue that's also complicated by our lack of governance and our balkanized electricity system here in the Northwest.
I knew there were people who knew more about this on this panel. Way to go. Thank you.
Okay.
Now back to you, Emily.
Thanks. So we know addressing our emissions statewide would require a sizable shift in state policy to make getting an electric car and transforming our transportation system more appealing and feasible. So how can cities and actions in Olympia address this change, and to what degree will it require intercity relationships to make it a successful transition?
Come on, Clark, you're
yeah, that's for the next. Yeah.
I'll kick it off here. So we have worked very hard to create intercity relationships for all of our climate and our future land use planning, because as several folks mentioned, we're in networks that are bigger than any city boundaries in terms of where people can afford to live, where they commute to work. And if you don't, years ago, Eileen led a project to do energy mapping of Thurston County and sort of look at our principal wedges of our consumption. And you can't do it just inside the city proper, or you can't do it just at a major employment hub. You have to look at where people live, where they go to school. So it means that these regional cooperations, I think, are just absolutely essential. King County has modeled this with all of the suburban cities working together to plan and think as a unit about individual city actions. So I would say that's super important. And I'd also say that we look to the state for resources, and the state looks to the federal government for resources. And I pray there's another ARA Recovery Act sort of big wheelbarrow of money coming that will eventually trickle down to the cities.
Yes, I think, Clark, you definitely pointed out what I would say from the 7 years that I worked with small and medium-sized cities throughout the Northwest with the New Energy Cities program when you and I worked together at Climate Solutions. Rachel had asked me a bit about this in advance, so I would say there are 3 points I would make. Number one, Clark was just hitting on, which is aggregation. What he's talking about was the King County Cities Climate Collaboration, which is called the K4C. And it's the county plus, I don't know how many cities now, to be honest, because I haven't worked with them in about 4 or 5 years. But back when it got started and we were working with them, it was about 13 cities. And the beauty of aggregating demand that way, all in 2 utility districts in the case of King County. So Seattle City Light was providing some power, and then Puget Sound Energy was providing both gas and electricity. You end up having a lot of demand, all aiming in the same direction. They choose the same targets, and they looked at their sources and uses of energy, and they realized that if they banded together and they went to Puget Sound Energy and they said, we have these targets where we have to be clean by X year, and you have to help us because you're the one who's got the coal and the gas in your portfolio. So aggregation is key, and then solidarity, where you all pick the same targets and then you all speak from the same song sheet when you go to Olympia to lobby. But I think what I would say about a lot of this is that the state level and the federal level are critically important. And Clark mentioned the Recovery Act that we experienced in 2009 and 10, and hopefully we will see something similar and even more advanced and more targeted, which I expect we will from the Biden administration, because Vice President Biden at the time oversaw the stimulus funds, and his team is largely the same team with a lot of other people have learned over the last decade. So I think that the most we can do at the state level now, which is why the state energy strategy, which the state just released in January, which my team provided the technical analysis for, is so important. And then federal. This transition is not to be done city by city, county by county. It really has to have a much more overarching approach, and having the whole country and certainly the state moving in the same direction.
So I also hope that in addition to legislations from the policies from the city or the government, we can also think about how as a region we can forge close partnership with industry. For example, Tesla, right? They are building a lot of charging stations, do those kind of things. But like Mark said, Tesla's market is primarily the sort of more luxury population. But GM just announced that they're going to be completely electric by 2030 or 2035. So we can partner with companies, try to develop the infrastructure or even the type of vehicles that all population can use. And locally, you know what? We have per car, we have Amazon. You know, Amazon, the distribution system, there's no reason it should not be electric, right? That's the ideal case for electric cars and deliveries. So I think if we all work to government, citizens, industry, all work together, we can make the progress much faster.
Thank you all so much for those responses. Now, looking at the data available to us regarding transportation system use and performance, along with the integration of new technologies, how soon could we transfer to a different source of energy without immobilizing our regional transportation systems and preventing the worst effects of climate change from occurring?
So you're back in my world. The shift from a performance perspective, an electric vehicle is a gasoline vehicle. It takes up the exact same amount of space. It's about 188 feet at 60 miles an hour on a freeway. Vehicles are not efficient space users. They are terrible space hogs. And it doesn't really matter if you're driving a Hummer or if you're driving, you know, the latest little Fiat. The distance is stopping distance. It has nothing to do with how long your car actually is. So EV changes the emissions profile, where you actually generate the energy and how those emissions are spread over it. But from a transportation performance, it has no impact other than your perception of what things cost. My answer there tends to be, for those of you who have a car, what does it cost you? What do you think it costs you when you decide if you're going to go to the grocery store? So Clark had a great example of how much energy you spend going to go pick up that pint of ice cream. The reality is, do you actually think about what it costs you to get in your car and drive to go get it? And the answer is most likely zero, unless you're out of gas or unless you're out of electrical charge. If you're out of gas, you're out of electrical charge, the cost of filling the tank you consider. Other than that, it's all about time and energy to go get it and come back. And if that is too expensive, you don't get the ice cream, you have the chocolate bar that you scrounged underneath the couch cushions, right? So the shift from gasoline to electric has, from a perceptual basis, almost no impact unless there's something unique about that vehicle that's really cool. So the big worry on the transportation side is autonomous vehicles. because once you have an autonomous vehicle and it drives itself, you don't have to pay attention, and the time you spend in the vehicle becomes productive, where productive can mean you're working on a laptop. It can be you're on, your latest video game. You've got a PS5. Who needs a screen because the car drives itself? So you're on the PS5 shooting aliens or whatever it is you do with your PS5. When that happens, then you don't care that you're commuting for 2 hours because you are working, you're doing other things, and then suddenly your energy usage goes through the roof. But that's an autonomous shift, not an EV shift. It's not a shift to the power mode. So from a performance perspective, electricity has almost nothing to do with whether the transportation system works or not, other than on the margins of whether you decide it's easy or cool to go travel. I can pontificate along that for a long time, but I'll be quiet. I give a great comedy talk about why autonomous vehicles are not good, but that's a different subject altogether.
I think if what's behind the question here is it too hard to switch from internal combustion engines to EVs, and if that's part of it and the cost, I agree with Professor Hallenbeck that that's really not, and it's becoming increasingly cheaper and cheaper. I think you see what's happened in Norway. You have this extraordinary policy support for electric vehicles, and the EV market share rose from 10 to 60% in just 5 years. So I am not, there's a lot that's written about the problems of EVs and the hesitancy and all the rest. The truth is, if once you drive one, you actually never want to drive another car again, because they really are, especially if you like cars, which I confess I do, they are fantastic to drive. They're just a blast. And if you can afford them, over time they are so much cheaper. So I don't think we're going to have an issue with uptake for that reason, because the cost is just going to drop so precipitously. It already is.
The only real uptake issue is range. If you solve range, many people run away from it. This is the perception. It's not realistic.
Yeah.
The perception is range is somehow going to come and cause me a huge problem.
Right.
And
but it's
other than that, if you solve that perceptual issue, you're good.
Right. But it's perception, because most people don't drive that far, even when you're commuting for those hours. So those are the issues. But there's infrastructure, right, that we do have to get in place. And so there are issues around the charging networks and all the rest, but it's not the cars. What were you going to say, Professor Liu?
I just want to applaud what you are saying. Electric car is going to happen, whether we like it or not. Okay, so yeah, and once you, like you said exactly, once you drive electric car, it's actually a much better car to drive. I said I have driven lots of Teslas. I have a hybrid. They just drive so much better. I drive like 300 miles every week to work in Richland, Washington. Used to be a problem. Now it's not really a problem anymore. It's so easy. The cost is going to drop. Okay, so the Tesla car, the cost is Tesla 3. It's continue dropping. It's going to drop to the same level with GM joining the team. It's going to drop to the same level as our gasoline cars. I have no doubt about that. That's going to happen within the next 5 years. And the range problem is really, Mark, you put it right, it's a perception problem. It's not a real problem. 90% of us don't drive more than 100 miles a day. Right, that's one thing. Another thing, even you want to have a long range, a good Tesla car with 120 kilowatt hour battery can do almost 600 miles now. So that's really decent, right? How many of us drive more than 600 miles a day? So all the things I have seen, I mean, GM, those guys, they used to despise Tesla. They think they're just a toy company. But look what happened this year. They couldn't resist anymore. They have to jump on it. So this is, I think, is one of the biggest change that's going to happen together with the renewable energy. We are going to a very different future, and the future is almost here.
I'm going to throw out one other really important thing for WashPirg to consider. And again, maybe technology will solve this, but we have to recycle batteries. Again, I will happily, I know almost nothing other than it will be an issue if we don't resolve it. And I'm sure people like Professor Liu are actually working very hard on it. But we will have to figure out how we are going to build batteries, where we're going to get the material to build those batteries. Do we actually have access to it in good places from an environmental perspective? They're going to have to build the batteries, and then they're going to have to be able to recycle the materials. And that's also going to be a real key thing. Now, yeah, I look at it and think, please, let's recycle them into new batteries. But I'm a traffic engineer. That's about all I can do.
Yeah, so you are exactly right. We have to, once we have the really large scale deployment, we have to have recycling program. But that's how it's going to happen. We have the technology. Right now, the technology is not widely used. So if you do it, it's expensive. What's going to happen, I think, is going to be some regulation that would force the ownership of the battery for lifetime. Whether it's a battery manufacturer or the car manufacturer, I cannot be sure. But what we need to look back is lead acid battery. What happened to it? So once the lead acid battery is made, it's designed to be completely recycled, and the program is totally working. So the same thing is going to work for lithium-ion batteries. There's no technological hurdle for doing that. So it's just a matter whether the automobile company would do that, or the car dealers would do that, or the battery manufacturers will do that. But it's going to happen. There's no other option.
But that takes us back to money, because if we have to build the cost of the recycling into it, that will bump up the car again, which will further put us back from being able to drive the prices of those vehicles down to the environmental justice world. So never underestimate the importance of how we pay for stuff. And while we love the state and federal government to come and give us money, remember that's our money in the first place. So always think, how would you like to pay for your transportation services? It's not how other people will pay for your services. How will you pay for your transportation services? And that's the environmental, that's environmental justice, that's quality of the service you get, the quality of the roads. How do you want to pay for them? And those are really important things for you to think about. But they're also really important things for you to press the legislature on once you decide how you want to pay for your stuff.
Yeah. So again, the lead acid battery is a good example, right? If you go get a new battery, you put in the old battery, you get, I forget, $5 or $10 back. And I think either the store or I think the battery manufacturer also pay for part of that. But once this, I think one of the things is economics of scale. Once this is done on very large scale, the cost will come down. I'm very confident of that.
I think that's true, but I also think it's important not to be so focused on the single occupant vehicle, and to think a lot about transit, and to think a lot about car share, and a lot about electric buses, and electrifying all of the systems. And somehow, if when we talk about policy, it has to really also be, again, on the equity and on this question of design and land use. It's somewhat anathema to Americans who all love their cars, and everybody likes to be in their own car. This generation that I believe I'm mostly speaking to here, although I can only see a handful of you, are not registering and getting as many cars. And I certainly hope that trend continues, and that there's much more of a sense of how to share cars rather than everybody owning their own. And then potential. I don't know whether Mark is laughing at me because I'm suggesting these ideas and they're bad, but from an equity point of view, I also think it's really important for us to try to figure out, I'm so concerned with COVID, what's happened to the transit ridership around the nation, and all these transit agencies are in such terrible shape. And again, transit is often what most people who can't afford cars are using. So there's a whole wider lens that I think we need to take when we think about transportation and not just the car.
I'm laughing because you've hit an absolute lodestone of my favorite topics. As a matter of fact, I predicted it, and I sent in a picture of the famous green slide, which I will happily chat about if you would want to. The reality is the land, while Clark is absolutely right, we are working very hard to bring people back into a much denser area where multiple modes actually make sense. The vast majority of America is built in a way that is essentially unservable by transit and by bikes and by walking. And therefore you're going to a motorized transportation, which means the car. And even Eileen yourself said you like your car and you're a car person. Well, you and 98% of all of the United States of America, you're not alone. The car is a wonderful mobility device. It works really well in rural areas. It is absolutely unbeatable in rural areas. It can be EV, great, no problem at all whatsoever. But to tell someone in a rural area they're going to car share it'll never happen. In most suburban areas of Thurston County, it will never happen, and with random exceptions here or there. And so that shift, much as I would love to make it happen, and you know how much of my professional career has been aimed at that, it will not happen very well. So the change to energy sources is the huge win from an environmental perspective, if you can generate it in a clean fashion. If you can store it in a clean fashion, if you can recycle it from an energy environmental perspective, those are great wins. From a transportation perspective, until somebody invents the mass transporter, as in Star Trek, we're going to continue to drive cars. And when they invent the Star Trek mass transporter, there will be a line at 8 o'clock in the morning and everybody tries to go to work. So I would love to go there, but don't hang your hopes on car sharing and bus. Yes, buses should be electric. Yes, we should do scooters to get the buses. Absolutely. But if you're talking Olympia and Thurston County, it's a really small shed that will actually make that work. So in Seattle, there's a big shed, but even there we have our limitations. And I'll happily bring up the famous green slide if you ever want to. But for now, I'll let you keep asking other questions.
Yeah, I guess wanted to just quickly cut in, this has been a pretty great discussion so far, and as clearly you can see there's been such an interdisciplinary kind of showcasing of ideas. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up kind of our discussion by asking our very last question. So it's as I've said, this is a very interdisciplinary and very multifaceted issue. There's so many components and levels to it, but basically to kind of wrap it up, what do you all think the ideal transportation system is? And how do groups like us as students and activists like Tara help us get into that direction?
I can go first or last. Do people have their preference? I talk too much. So
Go
first
ahead.
or last? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. The best transportation system is one that has multiple options. The more options you can provide people so that they know what those options are, the better it is. The people make their decisions based on perception. The better you can match their perceptions to their decisions, the better off you are. So from a transportation perspective, one of the best things we can do is to have a per mile charge where in your car, you see the counter go up on how much money you are spending. If you do that, you will drive much less, given everything else. When we hide what it costs to do something in time and money, we do all kinds of bad things because we ignore what it actually costs to go pick up that pint of ice cream. So the best transportation system is when I can give you many options: bike, walk, ride, drive by yourself, whatever, allow you to choose, but to be able to say, here are your costs, here are your benefits, think about this, and to give incentives to do your travel choices nicely. If you do that, life will turn out to be much better than it is now.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I certainly think the hidden costs in general and the subsidized costs that we have done certainly in our country for fossil fuels for all of these years, and the failure to have a social cost of carbon placed on the actual cost to our environment are a huge part of what I would want to see in the design. And considerable and careful design of the equity solutions where you bring the folks to the table for whom those decisions are being made and make sure that they are actually deciding in the same way that Mark's talking about choice. So too should the folks for whom these decisions are being made. They should be there at the table and making those decisions rather than having them made for them.
I would add that I think my ideal transportation system would go more slowly and less far. That if people were traveling shorter distances at slower speeds, that's a huge energy reduction, and it's a huge community building opportunity. And I'm thinking about I traveled through the countryside of the Czech Republic, and my host was showing me that there are two kinds of villages as you're going along. You can see right as you're coming along. The German model has a farmhouse at each farm. You live there. And the Slavic model has a village, and people walk or bike or whatever. They go out to their fields, but they live in a hub together. And I would close with saying we're at a point where encouragement has not moved people very much. And I think what you could advocate for as WashPirg is for regulation and taxes and fees, that it's time, if we're going to make our timeline for climate mitigation, we're going to have to push a little bit harder than urging everybody to please change their light bulbs. So I'm glad you're here tonight and that you're wrestling with these issues, and come lean on the city council. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry we are out of time, so
okay,
I'm gonna
all right.
say that is all for tonight. But thank you all so much for coming to our panel, and thank you for all, thank you to all of our wonderful panelists for being here and speaking. We learned so much from you, and we really appreciate you being here. If any of you are interested in our campaign, we normally have meetings from 6:30 to 7:30 on Tuesdays, and you can also reach out to our campaign coordinator, Cameron, at it's krharmon@uw.edu. And if you have any questions, reach out to him, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good
Have a good
luck.
rest of your
Thank
night.
you all for all your work.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.